At 2 p.m. and we have quite a few people that have logged in, so that's really, really great to see. So my name is Denise. I know you can't see me, but I am logged in, and I'm the Eastern Regional Coordinator with OCWI. So on behalf of the team, I'd really just like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon for the Exploring Demand-Led Business Engagement Strategies webinar. So this webinar is one of a series of webinars that OCWI is hosting, covering a range of topics chosen based on input from the various meetings and consultations we've had with individuals like yourselves across the province. At the very top of the list of interests was that of business employer engagement. So we're very excited to have Joe Dale present to us today. Joe is the Executive Director of the Ontario Disability Employment Network's Centre for Excellence in Employment Services for People with a Disability. The Centre focuses on engaging and educating businesses about the benefits of hiring people with a disability. Joe works closely with key stakeholders in the public and private sectors, offering his experience and expertise on disability matters. While the focus of Joe and Odin's work is the strategic engagement of people with disabilities in the workforce, Joe's experience and success in business engagement crosses sectors and population groups, and learnings will be beneficial to us all. So I just wanted to quickly cover a few logistics pieces before we get started. So Joe's presentation will be approximately half an hour, give or take. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to ask. He will open up the floor also at the end for any additional questions. So please use the Q&A function on the webinar to ask the questions, or you can also use the chat function so you can see both of those at the bottom of your screen. This presentation will also be available on our website at a later date, which can be used as a resource and a tool and can be shared within your network as well. So I'm going to hand it off to Joe to get us started.
Well, thank you very much, Denise. As Denise mentioned, my name is Joe Dale. I'm the CEO of the Ontario Disability Employment Network, otherwise known as Odin. And I'm going to start off just quickly with a little bit of an overview of Odin and the work we do, so that gives some context and some background. Odin's a very young organization. We've been in business for 10 years, and up until 4 years ago, we were totally a voluntary organization driven by membership without any staff resources. And then 4 years ago, we were fortunate enough to come across some resources and build a small staff team. We predominantly, our members are employment service agencies that predominantly support people with disabilities who are trying to get into the workforce from across the province and dealing with all types of disabilities in all regions of the province. So our mission and mandate is to address barriers and challenges facing job seekers who have a disability. We also were trying to create a provincial voice and an authority on employment and disability, which I think we've done quite successfully. To develop business engagement strategies and marketing initiatives, which is going to be the focus of today's talk, but also to help improve the capacity of the service sector. So just in our core business areas, that falls into business engagement, supporting the employment service sector, creating partnerships with government, and engaging other stakeholders who have a role to play in helping people with disabilities get into the workforce. And just quickly going in reverse order through those four areas so we can get to our business engagement strategies. When we talk about other stakeholders, it's often educators, colleges and universities, post-secondary, schools and school boards, community partners, so research collectives and others that impact either employment or employability for people who have a disability, and often families. So oftentimes we find families at their core need to have a better sense of hope and expectation for their family members who have a disability to ensure they start to pave the way for a future that includes a job and a place in the job market. In terms of our work with government, we do a lot of support with government around consultations related to policy design and development, funding models and things like that. We like to think that we provide government with the practical kind of on-the-ground experience that our members identify looking at promising practice, high-performing organizations, and what makes them high-performing, and what are some of the challenges, of course, and bringing our expertise to the table when it comes to working with government. In terms of our work with service agencies, we do a lot of work around strategic planning with employment agencies, a lot of staff training and development. This would be the biggest piece of our work with service agencies, training and developing and upgrading skills of job developers, job coaches, and so forth, and helping improve their ability to achieve better outcomes for their candidates who have a disability. We've recently launched a service quality initiative looking at standards of practice and a community of practice for employment service agencies, and that's just starting to roll out as we speak, and provide a lot of marketing advice and support. And of course, finally connecting to businesses, because we don't directly help people with disabilities ourselves. We rely on the employment agencies to support the job seekers and the candidates who have disabilities when it comes to actually fulfilling those jobs. So we make simply a matchmaking and a connection to businesses. And as what I've recently learned, we've come to be known as intermediaries, so connecting business to employment agencies. When it comes to our business engagement strategies, and this really goes to the core of what we do and the heart of our mission, developing business engagement strategies and marketing initiatives, and was part of our original mission in 2009, and still holds up today as a very prominent pillar of the work we do. What we've learned with our work with business and our understanding of business is that this has really started to influence everything we do. It influences the training that we provide to service agencies, our policy work with government, presentations to families and other stakeholders, because I think what we've learned is that really understanding in a very nuanced way and in a very detailed way how businesses relate to this equation and what their role is in hiring people who have a disability and in hiring generally is not really well understood. And it needs to really help us. We really need to understand it better in order to create better outcomes. And this has really enhanced and advanced our work and our agenda. You know, I've been in this business for over 40 years, and I think when it comes to really working towards helping people with disabilities get into the workforce, that's really been prominent for the last 30 or 35 years. And I'd have to say that over that time period, we have seen lots of success stories and individual successes, but really the unemployment rate for people with disabilities today is not significantly different than what the unemployment rate was for people with disabilities 35 years ago. So what that says to me is that, you know, we haven't made impact in a systemic way, and that we need to start looking at different ways to approach this work. And so I would say that for the last 35 years, most of our employment agencies, and for very good reason, but most have really focused on the people that they're supporting, the job seekers, people with disabilities. And if it's not disability, it's newcomers, it's youth, it's whoever your target candidate population is. That's where our focus has been, and we haven't put enough focus on the business and employer side of the equation. And from my perspective, and what we've learned in the last couple of years, is that when we start to put more emphasis on business-led and demand-side driven initiatives and demand-side thinking, that we're moving away from token hires to more systemic change. And as a bit of a subtext for Odin as a goal, part of our goal is also to move away from the service sector. So data that has been done in Ontario shows that if you have a disability, 66% of people with disabilities who are working are all working in the service sector. And it's an average of 15 hours a week at minimum wage. So these are all part-time jobs, minimum wage jobs. Rarely do they have benefits included, and they're very vulnerable. If we look at the recent um, move to higher minimum wage, these are the jobs that were most adversely affected by that move to higher minimum wage, where we saw job losses and reduction of hours and things like that. So if 66% of people with disabilities are working in the service sector, and depending on your disability, that could go up or down. If you have an intellectual disability, it's 80% of folks with intellectual disabilities who are working in the service sector. So, you know, we're overrepresented in that sector because if you look at the general population, it's only 24.5% of the general population that works in the service sector. So we're overrepresented. And why is that? And how do we get past that? So these are some of our bigger mission agendas, is to get to systemic change and to get broader representation in sectors beyond the service sector. That's not to say that service sector jobs don't have their place and that they aren't good and that there aren't benefits and appropriate matches for some people, but not to the level of participation that we currently see today. So then finally, it's the connecting supply to demand. And that's really what the way business looks at this is, how do we look at demand and supply? So for us, we've broken this down into a 5-step process. The first step is creating the appetite to hire. Second step is determining what the business needs. The third step is building capacity within the business. And you'll notice at this point, we haven't talked at all about people with disabilities and hiring people with disabilities. We really are focused on that business approach. What does business want and need, and how do we meet that need? Finally, when business is ready, then we look at connecting the supply to demand. And of course, always in business, you have to provide excellent customer service and make sure that you can troubleshoot and problem solve beyond the initial hire stage. So going through each of these, how we approach this, and it comes to creating the appetite, for us, we find that there's a real lack of understanding in the broader community about disability. So we do a lot of business education and awareness sessions about disability. We do that through chambers of commerce, through human resource professional association chapters, business improvement associations, Rotary clubs, any kind of business venue that we could be invited to provide speaking opportunities. We'll go and do that. But when we do those presentations, first and foremost, we look at disability as a marketplace issue. Business operators typically have no understanding that you know, people with disabilities comprise 22% of our population in Canada. So that's a big piece of the market. And when you add to that 22% family and loved ones, it's over 53% of people in our country are directly impacted by disability. This comes across to business as a complete shock. It's like, why don't we know this? Why don't we understand the marketplace of disability better? So we try to present this in language and terms that business understands. You know, how do they capitalize on this marketplace? How do they gain access to this marketplace as customers? How do they look at their existing workforce and understand that 53% of their current workforce is directly impacted by disability? And that relates to things like employee engagement and all those other factors. And then finally, the key for us is we always deliver these presentations with a business champion. So we have a whole host of business people that we've worked with, business people that have successfully hired people who have a disability, and we have them come to these business presentations with us and share their experiences and their stories. And I'll be honest, it is so powerful when that happens. You know, I can get up as a 40-year veteran of this work and have all sorts of expertise and talk for 30 minutes. and I might get, some recognition. But when a business person, a peer of the audience, stands up and in 5 minutes shares their experience, it's overwhelmingly compelling, and that the business audience relates to it and picks up on it much, much faster in a much more genuine way than simply listening to me, Joe, who has a vested interest in what I'm trying to achieve, right? The second step is ensuring businesses see people who have a disability as viable in their workplace. And we do this through showing a series of case studies of successful businesses, videos, storytelling. Often we'll use competitors of the business that we're trying to get into to show their successes and really create that sense of, oh, I get it. When we've done focus groups with businesses about this issue, what we hear over and over again is, we just can't picture what this would look like in our place of business. And so case studies really bring it home to them. It shows them real businesses that are doing this successfully and so forth. And again, we also will tap into our business champions as the part of the case study scenario. And I'm going to show you some examples later on of how that plays out. Once we've created the appetite in these broad-based general awareness sessions, and we have, one or two employers who stick up their hand or call us at the end, a few days later and say, okay, I'd like to try this. Then we really move into the next step, which is essentially determining what does that business need. So, we focus exclusively on the business at this stage. We don't talk at all about people who have a disability. We don't talk at all about hiring. We really talk about what does the business need to be successful. We had a scenario a few years ago when we worked with a big company, a very large company, and they hired successfully a number of people with disabilities through our support. And one of the things that they said, about a year later, we had an employer panel and the head of HR from this company at our conference. And this woman stood up and she said, the reason we picked Odin as our vendor of choice is because they're the first organization that has ever walked in our door and started the conversation by asking us what we need to be successful as a business. So there's two messages there. One is, this is a company that gets petitioned on a daily basis by employment agencies asking them to hire people with disabilities and people with youth and newcomers and so forth. But they get these requests daily, and we were the first ones who ever walked in, and instead of saying, hire our people, we said, what do you need? And that stood out for them. The second message there is, and I, to be honest, had never thought of this myself, is I never thought of us as a vendor at all, let alone a vendor of choice. But if business sees us this way, we have to pay attention to that. And if business sees us as another vendor, then how do we become the vendor of choice? And you don't become the vendor of choice by always trying to sell a product or a person. You become a vendor of choice by solving problems for that business, and by meeting business needs. So focusing exclusively on the business without even thinking about the job seekers is important first step. We do lots of research in advance of our meetings. We use a process called informational interviews, which is very effective at getting to understand the business. We get tours of the businesses, and really it's all about getting to understand the business and what their needs are and the specific jobs that they're looking to fill and where they have problems and challenges that are labor-based that we can help with. And I think, we find that this is a skill set that most employment agencies don't have a real grasp of, that most of the people who work in our sector are people who got into the business because they want to help people, and they're great at supporting people with disabilities and supporting other job seekers and so forth. But it's an an important part of the equation because employment is a two-sided piece. You have your employer who needs labor, and you have your job seekers who want those jobs. If both sides aren't happy with the results, then you won't have success. So it's important to really understand what drives business, what drives individual businesses, because they're all different, and also understanding specific businesses or business sectors. And there's been a lot of research about a sectoral approach to job development, which I think is something that's really well worth pursuing. Once we've determined the business needs, in our case, then it moves on to building capacity. So we understand from talking to businesses that they want and they need to be successful. And so when they hire someone, they want that employment situation to be successful. So we go into that approach with that approach of saying, we want you to be successful and we're going to help you be successful. Building capacity is important to the long-term success and retention of the job seekers, the employees, and also to the business. And we're quite forward about it. We tell the business our objective is to help them build their internal capacity so that they can hire, recruit, and retain and advance employees who have a disability as a regular part of doing business. And from that, we get very positive feedback because they like that idea of building their skills and their knowledge base. And of course, our approach is to make it as simple as possible, because one of the misconceptions and the myths is that hiring people with disabilities is difficult, it's challenging, and so forth. So every time we look at our next step with a business, we step back and say, could this be easier? Can we simplify this to make it straightforward for the business and put it in a context the business would understand? And of course, you know, over the course of these meetings and conversations, we're also building trust and credibility of our own organization with the business. And a few side effects that come from that is we find businesses more than willing to open their books to us, to share their recruitment processes, to let us sit in on interviews, to even circumvent processes and to change and adjust processes that they use once we've identified for them the benefits of doing this. So having that trust and building that capacity is important. Specifically in building the capacity, that's when we actually move into this from a consultancy perspective. So once the business has identified their needs and acknowledge that we can help them fill their needs and meet their needs, then we typically write a proposal, and a proposal to work with the business with all the steps that we believe it's going to take to help them build capacity and be successful at recruiting, onboarding, and retaining employees with disabilities. And we put that into a consultancy proposal. And we actually have a fee structure that we put with it. And I'm happy to say that all of the businesses that we're working with today are all paying us to help them hire people with disabilities. And I think this is a model that resonates because businesses pay for consultants all the time, whether it's human resource consultants, financial consultants, production and engineering consultancy. Why shouldn't we be seen as consultants as well? And if businesses value it, why shouldn't they pay for it? And so this is the model that we've adopted. Some of the things we do is to review the recruitment and onboarding processes. We'll review job descriptions and online portals, all of this with the idea of reducing or removing barriers that might prevent people with disabilities from being successful. We'll do physical accessibility audits and accommodations once the jobs have been identified, evaluation of specific roles and jobs, and training, and more training. So most of the businesses that we work with have us do training for their managers and supervisors, providing them with disability awareness and sensitivity training, lunch and learn sessions for senior leaders in the businesses, everything that's going to help them build their understanding and capacity, but also help them move towards success. The last thing you want is, an HR person to come in and hire someone who has a disability, and then to have a line manager or a supervisor going around thinking they have somebody with a burden on their team, who's going to be a burden on their team. So we have to build that capacity and knowledge base right across the board. And then finally, we connect them to the supply side, and that would be the employment agencies in their community, and so forth. When it comes to those connections, there are some intricacies there as well. First of all, we need to connect to a reliable service agency, and there isn't a consistency of service quality across the province and across communities, and we need to kind of work towards that, to achieving that goal. But essentially, we take the approach of matching the basic job requirements to an agency that supports the most suitable candidate pool. And so that's really looking at the jobs and then looking at the agencies and the candidates that the agencies are servicing. And it's important for us to understand and have knowledge about the agency world and how they operate, because our reputation is interlinked with the agency's competency. So if the agency drops the ball on providing proper supports or proper referrals, then it looks bad on everyone, including ourselves. And this often identifies the need for us to provide supports to the agency, and I'll go through a bit of an example of that in a few minutes. But often the agencies need then to be introduced to the business, and we spend time with the agency talking about the culture of the business, the types of supervisors, the types of jobs. When we're working with the business, we'll get job descriptions and physical demands analysis and so forth from the business to share with the agency, so the agency can be well prepared when they come forward. The last step is customer service. So customer service is always important. Ongoing support, troubleshooting, and problem solving, and this can happen, long after the hire, where operators run into challenges, or managers or supervisors have questions about certain aspects of the employees that they have hired, and how to resolve challenges or issues. Sometimes it's when, and this is happening more and more for us now, is when businesses want to expand their hiring, then sometimes we have to have multiple service agencies all at the table in order to supply enough candidates to meet the needs of that business. So as an example, last year we had worked with the Canadian National Exhibition. They hired 150 young people for summer jobs, and we had 8 agencies involved in order to supply enough candidates to meet the CNE's needs. So there was a lot of coordination of those service agencies and so forth. Acting as an intermediary sometimes between the business and the service agency to make sure everybody's on the same, has the same understanding and are in the same place and working smoothly. General assistance in maintaining the relationship with the business. I've even had human resource managers call me 2 or 3 months after the fact and say, we had a bit of a disciplinary issue, and this is what we did. Is that okay? And sometimes they just need that reassurance of someone to call who's purportedly the expert, who says, well, yes, that's okay, but what would you have done if the employee didn't have a disability? And in this particular case, the business said, well, we would have done blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, then you should also do blah, 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 blah for that candidate who has a disability, so that they'll learn and so that the rest of your workforce sees that there's no preferential treatment. And the HR manager basically said, oh, so it's okay to do that? And I said, yes, it's okay to treat people with disabilities the same way you treat everyone else. But it's having that reassurance and being available to them that really retains that ongoing relationship with the business. So that mentoring and handholding is also an important aspect. And sometimes we have opportunities to enhance the business's understanding and do more of their capacity building, coming up with creating new strategies. So in the case of the Canadian National Exhibition, the first year we worked with them, they hired about 55 people with disabilities. Going into year two, they wanted to increase those numbers, but they also identified a desire to learn how to hire people with more significant disabilities. So we strategized with them, and we came up with a really neat concept of having employee mentors, so that students that they were hiring back on the second year who didn't have disabilities became mentors and mentored some of the new students who had disabilities. So this worked in a number of positive ways for the CNE. They were able to meet their goals of hiring more people with a disability and hiring people with more significant disabilities, but it also reduced their supervisory burden by having mentors within their existing workforce. And often we find businesses telling us the same thing when we adjust and modify their recruitment strategies and their interview processes. They'll say, you know what, this works way better for everybody, which is ultimately a great goal. So they see the benefit beyond simply the hire of the person with the disability. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of case studies and show you how this plays out for us. And what's important here and for us, this is our tagline when we work with businesses always. It's enhancing business performance through innovative labor strategies. It's not hire the disabled, it's good for you, it's good for them. It's really how do we enhance business performance through innovative labor strategies? And that sets a different tone for us across the board. So a couple of case studies. We started working a few years ago with Dare Foods. And so that you see how this plays out, we did a general awareness presentation with the Grand River Human Resource Professionals Association in December of 2014. And I had one of our business champions with me sharing their experiences. About a year and a half later, Dare Foods contacted us and said, oh, are you the guys who did that presentation at the Grand River? Of course, yes, it was us. And they said, okay, we think we need to hire and we'd like to try including people with disabilities in our new hiring strategy. So we started working with them in March of 2016 and really working on identifying what their business needs were, building their capacity, which was about 8 or 9 months for them. It was a new production line, so there was a whole host of activity around matching the accommodation requirements with their new production requirements, and also setting up new workstations in a new physical environment, new equipment, and the whole host of tasks. But it was a little longer than what would be typical, but it was about 9 months of working with them, and that included training for every single person who worked at Dare Foods. They wanted the sensitivity and awareness training for everyone, had us come in the middle of the night and do training for the night shift, the day shift, the afternoon shift, the managerial and salaried employees across the board. We introduced the service agency to them in November of 2016, and their first hires were in February of 2017. So that's a fairly long, drawn-out time frame. But this is one business, and what we see with the success is that the businesses start to multiply, and you're dealing with multiple businesses all at the same time. So it's not as if we're doing nothing other than Dare Foods over this period of time. So in their case, they hired 7 people right off the bat in February of 2017. And what they found in performance was turnover rate for their employees with disabilities was lower than their standard. Absenteeism was lower than their standard. And they believe they saved over $200,000 in the first 9 months of having this inclusive hiring strategy. Further to that, they hired 10 people with disabilities in one of their other distribution centers in South Carolina, and have since gone on and hired 3 additional people in their Cambridge facility. So they're up to 10 hires now. So these jobs are all full-time. well above minimum wage, pension plans, benefits plans, and unionized. And in their case with Dare Foods, they specifically came to us and said, we particularly would like to hire people who have a developmental disability, which, you know, some businesses have an idea of what they want to do and others don't, but in their case, they were very specific. And that's how we approached it. But the fact is that all 10 of these people who work there now in these unionized positions all have developmental disabilities. From there, Dare referred us to Chumleys. Dare's in Cambridge, Chumleys is in Milton. So they referred us to Chumleys. We had a couple of meetings with Chumleys, and we invited the production manager from Dare to attend the meeting with us and share their experience with Chumleys. And this is where that business champion piece comes in, because the production manager from Dare shared all of the benefits that they'd seen from hiring people with disabilities, talked about how easy it was compared to what they had anticipated, promoted us as a very positive and credible business solution. So we were endorsed quite heartily. And one of the interesting things for me was this was happening at Chumleys right as the minimum wage increases had been announced to go to $14 and $15 an hour, which of course now we know $14 an hour. And the production manager from Dare Foods said to the production manager from Chumleys, our solution to the minimum wage increase is to move away from using temporary services, labor services, and to hire more permanent full-time employees, and more of those are going to be people who have a disability. So an endorsement all the way around. So Chumleys engaged us to assist them with their hiring strategy. The work was challenging because Chumleys is a very conservative operation, and not every one of these is going to be, you know, fully successful. So our work with Chumleys stalled a little bit. They hadn't fully bought in. We did have a few hires, which worked out quite well, and it looks like we'll have more in the next little while as well. But interestingly enough, Chumleys referred us to Rockwall. Now, Rockwall is also a manufacturer in Milton doing insulation manufacturing. So they referred us in November of 2017. Our first meeting with the HR manager in Rockwall was December of 2017, followed by a presentation to their senior leadership team in February of 2018. We submitted our proposal to them in March and began our work in March of 2018 to work with them. And that was the whole gamut of training, interview process, recruitment process, job descriptions, the whole review and assessment of all of those things with adjustments. They made their first job offers in August of 2018. And first candidates started with Rockwall in September of 2018. And in their case, Rockwall hired 6 people who are profoundly deaf, 3 of whom also have a developmental disability. So just going through that, assessing their needs, we did the tours, the informational interviews, building the relationship, reviewing their processes, recruitment, onboarding, job descriptions, the whole works. What are the job skill requirements? What's the workflow, the equipment, accessibility, all of those things. And then connecting to the employment agency. And once we connected them and it was agreed that they were going to hire people who are profoundly deaf, we had to go back and rework some of the accessibility requirements. And in this case, we also had to provide training for the agency who had very little experience in employment services, and training for their job coach and so forth. So training at all levels. Again, they were another company that wanted us to do disability awareness and sensitivity training throughout the whole business for all staff, mentoring and coaching for managers, and eventually tours of the Bob Rumble Center, which is the agency involved, and the Drury School for the Deaf in Milton. Because Rockwall was very keen on creating a pipeline of candidates that they could see in the future fulfilling their needs down the road. We had job coach participation at the interviews, interpreting services, and all of those supports. As I mentioned, we also had to build capacity at the Bob Rumble Center, as they had very little experience. So we had to educate them about employment services delivery, about job coaching, and most importantly about the business relationship and how to meet Rockwall's needs and so forth. And there was even a bit of employment preparation for their job seekers. The results were 7 interviews, 6 job offers. These jobs start at a starting wage of $23 an hour, plus a $3 an hour shift premium. They all have benefits and pension plans. They're all unionized positions. So the 6 people started in September. By December, 2 of those individuals were up for promotions because of their performance. One was going to go into training to be a forklift operator, which would be a promotion in this environment. And one was looking to become an assistant line supervisor. And a third candidate finished their probationary period in 8 weeks versus the traditional 12 weeks because they had worked so many hours in overtime hours, which, you know, if you look at the wages of $23 an hour, that all of a sudden becomes $31.50 an hour in overtime rates. These 6 people are all completely off of social assistance. They were predominantly on ODSP, and a couple actually lived in agency-run group homes as well, and are now looking to go to move into their own places. And from the perspective of Rockwall, this quotation, this partnership has far surpassed our expectations and enabled us to roll out a new product line faster than ever anticipated. And I should say this month, Rockwall is also interviewing an additional 6 or 7 people with the goal of hiring 5 more people by February. So it's growing quite quickly as well. And an interesting story, because I think we have to, you know, we're driven by the people, the job seekers, the people we support and so on. And this was just an interesting story that one young man who had a developmental disability and who was profoundly deaf went to his supervisor at the Bob Rumble Center after he was made the job offer and wanted to know and understand how much money is $49,000. And after the supervisor at the agency kind of stammered around a little bit trying to explain to him how much money it was, the young man said, "Well, my father says he makes $45,000 and he owns his own house. Does this mean I can buy a house too?" And you know, this ultimately, this is the measure of success that we're really seeking for all the candidates and the people that we support in this industry. And as I say, there's you know, a couple of things about this. You know, one is moving to that more systemic change where Rockwall now believes they're going to engage a number of candidates with disabilities, and it's going to be central to their business operations going forward. Creating that pipeline with the Drury Center and the Bob Rumble Center is a great step forward, and we'll see many more successes like this.
People with disabilities.
So just this next little video, I think gives you a bit of an example of the flavor of how we approach business when we talk about looking at disability as a marketplace issue and how it changes the context of how a business views our goals of hiring people with disabilities as a business opportunity rather than a good deed to the community, rather than corporate social responsibility, rather than hiring as an act of charity, which we think is a much stronger case. So I'll show you this little video.
People with disabilities represent over 1.3 billion people globally. When combined with friends and family, the disability market touches 53% of consumers and controls over $8 trillion in annual disposable income. The size and scope of this market is large and unrealized. People with disabilities have functional demands that dovetail nicely with the needs of aging baby boomers and represent a viable talent source as labor markets tighten. The disability market is tipping. Are you ready? The return on disability model highlights specific actions each business can take to maximize value by delighting their customers, attracting great talent, and leveraging innovation from people with disabilities to making existing assets more productive. Companies that enhance their customer experience by utilizing insights from the disability market outperform their peers in revenue growth. Public and private organizations that hire individuals with disabilities with motivated intent benefit from employees who generate lower costs and higher productivity, resulting in higher returns. Leveraging insights from disability drives productivity. Complex and costly processes become simplified and more efficient overall when designed by and for people with disabilities. Top organizations understand this model and use it to their advantage. Disney incorporates park design features for the disability market, enhancing customer experience for all. It continuously incorporates the disability experience into its on-screen characters, bonding with its customers, and making Disney a leader in value creation. Google's disability-driven innovation leads to product design it then applies to its core customers. From the beta stage, disability market needs are the inspiration for Google's many now mainstream innovations. Google Glass, Google Voice, and Google Car find their roots in disability and drive Google to the top ranking in ROD research. TD Bank is a leader in value creation due to the inclusion of people with disabilities in their talent pipeline, as well as how the company talks about the disability market as a driver of their business. TD sets an excellent example for brands wishing to communicate the connection of disability to business results. Attract the disability market and improve customer experience. Grow your top line, find the right talent, and increase shareholder value for investors. Do disability right to delight customers and shareholders. Connect with us to get started today.
So just a little bit of the flavor of how we approach this. Some of the companies we've worked with, not all of them, but what we're finding today is more and more of these companies are referring other companies to us, and those doors get opened a lot faster when that happens because we seem to become trusted vendors of choice, so to speak. Just before I've gone a little bit over my 30 minutes, but before I close out and provide openings for questions and so on, just a couple of contextual things that we hadn't really anticipated that we have emerged based on our approach. One is that we rarely anymore talk about people who have a disability. What we talk about is people's skills and abilities and their ability to meet the needs of the business, which is interesting because philosophically we often talk about focusing on abilities and assets of people rather than their disability, but we see that actually happening in practice now. You know, the businesses all know we're talking about candidates who have disabilities, but the conversation is never about disability. It's only ever about people's abilities to meet the company's needs. The second thing is when we started charging fees for our work, a few things happened. First of all, it's a great indicator to us that the business is serious and really has bought in and wants to do this in a significant way. So, you know, before when we didn't charge fees, we'd get, you know, businesses that were kind of so-so and lukewarm and so forth. But now we know when a business puts money on the table that A, they see value in this, and B, they're fully committed. And finally, I guess the other side of that is for us, it raises our level of accountability in performing to the needs of the business when we're being paid for it. Not to mention it gives us some flexibility around, you know, having revenue streams other than government and the flexibility to do things that are outside of our contractual obligations to government that, you know, let us experiment a little bit and try new things. So I'm going to stop there. There's still 15 minutes or so. If people have questions, you can either go off mute and ask your question, or you could do it through the chat box and just type in a question. And I'll do my best to answer as many questions as I can.
Sorry, just quickly, attendees actually can't speak. There's no, yeah,
Okay.
sorry, there's no mic option for attendees, so you'll have to type it into. But we do have a question in the Q&A.
Okay.
Joe.
I
So-
can't access the Q&A, so maybe you can tell. Oh, do I see it now? Sorry, I gotta look at my.
No problem. You can go ahead and read it.
Would it be possible to receive the slides we viewed here today, please? I don't see why not. In fact, I believe OCWI is recording the session. Is that correct?
Yes, we are. Yeah.
And so I assume the whole session slides and my voiceover would be available.
Yeah, we can definitely share the slides separately as well as the video.
Okay. That was an easy question. So, amazing. Thank you. That's not a question, but thank you. Interesting and helpful presentation. When can we expect to receive the information? I'm going to defer to Denise on that one.
It shouldn't be that long. We're just going to make sure that the video is edited and things. So just stay tuned on our website, and we'll definitely send it around to all the people that have tuned in today. So you'll get an email when the video is ready.
Okay. Could you share the sources of the data on sectors of employment for persons with disabilities? I assume you're talking about like the 22% of the population and things like that. Those are predominantly coming from Statistics Canada. We do use data around things like turnover and absenteeism and things like that, but you know, to be honest, we're moving away from that data a little bit because we're sensitive to, you know, we don't want to paint a picture of people who have a disability to be kind of superhuman and you know, everybody being extraordinary, because really what we want to get to is the point where everybody is seen and treated equally. And so this is where, you know, when we used to do more of a business case approach, and there is data to support it, interestingly enough, you know, lower turnover, lower absenteeism, better safety records. It's in a variety of sources, but we're kind of moving away from that and moving into, as I identified, showing case studies with people who have a disability at work in the workplace to be a viable source of labor for businesses and to work effectively. But the data comes from many, many different sources, and so I'd have to do some work to say, you tell me what data you're thinking of that I might have recited, and I'll do my best to find the source for you of that data. Is that okay? Do you contact hiring managers or HR? Okay, well, typically, almost the first stop by default is HR. It's not our best or what we want to do, but typically in a medium to large size business, this issue is always referred to HR. And that's okay, but we're pretty straightforward with the HR people. When we have a meeting and they understand it and they're interested, we say right up front to them, you know, in order for this to be successful, we need to engage your senior leadership. So why don't you let us come and do a lunch and learn for your senior leadership? And you also need to have your line managers and supervisors on board because they're the people who are going to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. And I don't think we've had a situation yet where we haven't gotten those two things offered to us. So, you know, at this point, we're not charging fees yet because it's still under our educational mandate. But we will do a lunch and learn for senior leadership, and we get those invitations routinely from the HR people. Sometimes it takes a bit of time to set them up, which is why you'll see in those two case studies the length of time it took to do things. But they understand that they need senior leadership support. And then when we get to the frontline managers and supervisors, that's usually where we're training and we're being paid to do that training. So Yes, starts typically with HR, but we try to direct it very quickly to senior leadership. And we also get approached often with companies that are talking about doing this as part of their corporate social responsibilities. And we typically try to talk them out of that and try to show them why it's in their best interest to look at it as a business opportunity and as a business venture. And from our perspective, that's much more sustainable. You know, anytime a business goes through a difficult economic situation, the first thing that goes is their charitable work and their corporate social responsibility work, and that often means layoffs and terminations. So we try to get them right from the get-go to understand this is a business model and that there's business opportunity for them. Jonathan Meadow, okay, thanks. That approach makes a lot of sense. I was also thinking of the percent of persons with disabilities in the service. Okay, so there was a study done in the southwest part of Ontario from 1997 to 2003. So it was done for 6 years. And each year we tracked 2,500 people with disabilities who were all trying to get into the workforce with the assistance of service agencies, and what the results were for that, for those 2,500 people. And it was very interesting. We tracked it based on the disability type, based on who funded the service, and the results varied significantly. But some of the interesting results were that we found people with developmental disabilities to be the most successful group at both finding and retaining employment, followed by people with mental health issues around finding employment but not retaining employment, and so forth. But clearly it demonstrated 66% of people with disabilities all working in the service sector, and in the same geographic region at the same time, it was 24.5% of the non-disabled population that worked in the service sector. And as I said earlier, if you had an intellectual disability, it went up to 80% working in the service sector. And we shopped that study called the Employment Outcomes Project around the province in other geographies, and everybody said the data pretty much resonated with their experiences. And we've actually been looking at renewing that study, you know, perhaps in the next couple of years to see if the situation has changed any. I would suggest it hasn't changed much, and perhaps has even gotten worse based on, you know, the targeted fundings and the performance-based fundings that agencies are kind of forced into a situation where they have to either meet their check boxes or get the quickest, easiest job they can. But fascinating for us is that when we get into these other businesses, so Chumleys, Dare Foods, Rockwall, as examples, the jobs in Rockwall at $23 an hour are less complex than the jobs at Tim Hortons. If you take the typical jobs at Tim Hortons of bussing tables and cleaning and serving coffee, they are much more complex than the jobs at Rockwall. And think about it, you know, union, benefits, pension, $23 an hour, full-time, and less complex, less challenging jobs. Just because when you get into those businesses, they're process-driven, and you see firsthand when you do these tours the opportunities that are there that we hadn't previously considered for candidates who have a disability. Okay, so hello, I may have missed you, but you spoke of clients with disabilities, and I was not clear on if they were only physical and cognitive. No, we see all types of disability. You know, through the service agencies, we've had some businesses hire people with autism, some businesses hire people with developmental disabilities, physical disabilities, hearing impairment. We've seen pretty much the gamut, and so forth. Do you get companies asking for incentives? Rarely. And in fact, when we work with service agencies, if the service agency has incentive programs, we actually say that they're not to be used. We have had occasional companies ask for incentives, And usually when we explain to them, you know, the connection to the paperwork and government with incentives, and that in many cases you can get the incentive or job coaching, but rarely can you get both. They usually just say, okay, that's fine, don't worry about it. We'll just do it straight up. From a philosophical place, we find it contradictory to what our approach is. So if we're saying to a business, there is value in hiring people with disabilities, this is a viable solution to your workplace needs, we're solving your problems, your labor challenges and your problems, and you're going to pay us for that, then it just seems contradictory to then put an incentive in front of them. So we steer clear of incentives, and that's been our approach, and it has not challenged us in the least. Can you elaborate on the disadvantages of appealing to a company's CSR as opposed to the model you've adopted? Well, as I mentioned, fundamentally, we have a challenge in North American society to get society in general to stop looking at people with disabilities as objects of charity and pity. And when we appeal to businesses to do things based on charity, it's a tougher sell. We end up getting, when it does work, it's one token hire as opposed to more systemic change. And as I mentioned, economies in business drive those businesses. And when economies shift and are tighter and profits margins shrink, then what's the first thing businesses let go of? They let go of their charitable acts and their corporate social responsibility. We believe that if they see people with disabilities as valuable employees, they will be less likely to be the first to be let go when downsizing happens. It'll be done more based on productivity and production demand as opposed to charity and saving on that charitable money. Our ranges of costs for employers. Okay, so this is something that's kind of evolving, because this is, you know, it's only been 2 years for us, and I'll be honest, the first time we put a proposal in front of a business with a cost attached to it, my stomach was in knots, wondering if I was going to kill the whole deal or whether they were going to buy it. But our charges range depending on what the business needs and wants, and it's a little bit different in every business. So we scope things out. If we're going to do a review of job descriptions, we need to know how many job descriptions. We need to see some samples so that we can say, okay, we believe it's going to take us X number of hours to do all your job description reviews and make recommendations with a report on how to adjust them to be more accommodating and to remove those barriers. And we put a fee to that. So, you know, typically we're charging at about $1,500 a day or $200 an hour. Our training is typically a little more expensive because we're doing more of it and to bigger audiences and so forth. So that gives you a rough idea of the ranges, but every proposal is different depending on the size of the business, the number of jobs, the amount of processes that the business wants us to work through and review with them and so forth. Okay, so what is the best method when first approaching businesses? Is it through HR or managers? How can services providers connect with Odin? Okay, well, two different questions, but the best method when approaching businesses is any business any way you can get there. We find when we do our presentations, our general educational presentations, like I said, through chambers of commerce, HRPA chapters, Business Improvement Association meetings, Rotary Club meetings, you know, it's whoever picks up on it and refers you to, we'd like to meet with you at our company. I'm going to introduce you to our HR person or whatever. But typically the serious business, once and a business has said, yes, we'd like to would like to explore this with you, usually the first connections are with HR. And as I said earlier, we try to swing that after the first meeting to say, step one is to do a lunch and learn with your senior leadership team. So that's how we approach it. How can service providers connect with Odin? Well, you can contact me there, or you can go to our website and we can connect that way.
So we are almost done. So Joe, if you'd like to address the last few questions in there, and then we'll wrap things up.
Okay, the next question is, I think we've dealt with the disadvantages of appealing to corporate social responsibility. The last question I see here are the service providers that we work with predominantly disability specific, or do you work with general population providers who's with some okay, so we do both. Some of our member agencies are disability specific. Some support all disability groups, and some of the EO providers that provide generic employment services. But when we go to those people, we specify that we're looking for referrals of candidates who have a disability, and that's strictly because that's our mandate. And that's the platform that we've sold our business to the business with. But I believe the model is transferable regardless of your target population of job seekers. That's my personal belief. And it looks like, Denise, we've run out of questions just as we've run out of time.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Joe, for this very insightful webinar. We've had lots of people that logged in, and again, it will be available at another time. So thank you again so much for speaking with us today.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
All right, bye-bye, everyone.
Okay.